Okay, now that we have a good understanding of what mechanics are and right our major level mechanics, let's talk about this concept of IPM. Right? So this concept of IPM, that stands for introduce, practice, and master. And this is a way to uh, introduce new mechanics to players and then reuse them throughout the course of the game or the level without causing the content to become stale or boring or overwhelming. Right? So when you introduce a mechanic to a player, right, the first time the player is introduced to that mechanic, you want it to be very easy to understand and in a safe space. All right, so it should be in a safe space for the player to interact with and learn that new mechanic. And you don't want to be punishing the player here and charging them for their failure, right? If I get all the way through the level and I get introduced to a new mechanic and I mess up and die, going all the way back to the beginning of the level is quite the punishment for just being introduced to the mechanic for the first time. So going back to our Mario example, right, we're talking about jumping with Mario. Think about when, and now we're talking about the original Super Mario Brothers, when you're introduced to the jump mechanic. You're introduced to it right at the beginning of the game, right? There's a Goomba coming at you, and you pretty much have a certain amount of time to learn how to jump. Otherwise, the Goomba will kill you, and then you'll be spawned right back at the beginning. So in this situation, there definitely is a punishment for the failure, right? We lose a life. But then we just go back to the same spot and we are able to retry again. So very minimal punishment. All right, so right there, right, we're introduced to that jumping mechanic. So going forward and practicing, right, we're able to use the mechanic in a more advanced way or in a little bit more difficult setup, right? So to practice, right, this proves that the player understands how to efficiently use the mechanic. They understand all of the nuances about the mechanic or are starting to use it in different ways. All right, so at this point too, with practice, you might also start to see it in some games, definitely that you're playing, that they're incorporating other mechanics into the mechanic that is single mechanic as well to offer that challenge. So here's a great example in Mario, and this is really early on in the first level. The concept of communicating to players, the longer you hold down the A button, the higher you jump, right? So we're still just jumping, but how we're jumping can affect the interaction, right? So we're starting to understand those little nuances with that jump mechanic. And then, of course, you can definitely argue that a lot of the first few levels you're practicing that mechanic. It's not like practice happens in just one place in the level and that's it. In the larger titles, when mechanics are reused to create tons and tons of content, there are a lot of these single elements. These are just small instances that we're pointing to. And then mastery, right? This is using the mechanic in the most advanced or in an advanced way or a very challenging setup, right? So your mastery mechanic should definitely challenge the skills of the player and test how well they can actually use that mechanic, right? And again, just like practice, this is often incorporated with other mechanics to add in difficulty or more of a challenge. All right, so here you can see two images on screen. The one at the top is looks like World 5 in one of the castles in Mario. And again, just talking about jumping, you can see that now we have to jump across these little these platforms, and then down below is that lava, right, or the fire that if we fall into, we die and we have to go back to a checkpoint. So definitely we don't want to miss one of our jumps. And then also at the same time, you can see that there is this little fireball, right? We got that little fireball right there that we need to avoid and time our jump properly, as well as these spinning fireballs, which always kill me. These are spinning around in this, circular pattern. So we need to avoid this obstacle, not fall in the lava, and avoid this spinning trap, as well as if we are good and we're fast enough, we can get a collectible or a power up for our challenge, right, or accomplishing that task. So there's a great example of a mastery setup. And then down below is one that really pushes it even further beyond that, almost showcasing how well that player knows that mechanic, right? Because they're able to just run and jump across this very massive gap and they know the collision so well of Mario that they're able to make some pretty impressive jumps across that little section. So this definitely happens sometimes to where players can start to utilize and embrace mechanics even further than was intended by the design. Right? In this situation, our designer may have wanted you to start it on one of these two blocks to actually jump across. But here you're able to see you can do it just starting running on the ground if your timing is good enough.